not encouraging or advising anyone to modify their firearms. This is for entertainment and educational purposes only.
Hey everyone, what's up? This video will be about improving the P226 double single action trigger system. We got lots of things to try: springs, enhanced leverage system, super strut system, pre and over travel adjustment, and some polishing. This pistol came with the factory short reset trigger system. I made a video explaining how the DASA trigger system operates, and in that video I showed how the SRT sear and safety lever reduce reset distance by about 60 to 70%. If you're interested in that, link will be in the description. If your pistol doesn't have the short reset kit, I would highly recommend installing it. It makes a big difference. SIG sells it for 50 bucks. Grayguns also offers one for 85. Let's get a baseline and look at the factory trigger action. This pistol has maybe 300 rounds through it so far. There's a little bit of light take up before the double action pull starts compressing the mainspring. Double action is heavy. It maxes out my 10-pound gauge. My guess is it's around 12 pounds. It's a little bit stagey, but it's not too bad. It's pretty smooth. The single action take up has a stage right there. I can feel it right there. And that is the safety lever coming into contact with the firing pin block up in the slide and starting to compress it against spring force. Firm wall. Crisp feeling break. Here's the reset. Pretty short. Again, this P226 Elite has the short reset sear and safety lever installed from the factory. Single action pull weight is right around 5 pounds. The brake feels crisp because the brake is heavy and you snap through the creep pretty fast after the wall. If I control the trigger with my other thumb, you can see there's a little bit of creep and then just a tiny bit of over travel. The creep in the brake is not due to excessive hammer and sear engagement. There isn't much. It's due to the leverage ratios of where your finger pulls the trigger shoe and where the trigger bar connects to the trigger in relation to this pivot point, and where the trigger bar grabs the sear and where the sear grabs the hammer hook in relation to the pivot point of the sear. I got a spring kit from Armory Craft. It came in a bundled deal with the SIG Armor Super Strut. It's a pretty good price for both. It has a factory firing pin block spring, sear spring, and firing pin return spring. It comes with 19, 18, 17, and 16 pound mainsprings and a reduced power sear spring. If I'm not mistaken, the factory mainspring in the P226 is around 24 pounds. Rather than try all the different combinations of these springs, I'm just going to install the lightest 16-pound mainspring and the reduced power sear spring and see where that gets us, and then you can kind of guess there's going to be some combinations of these springs that are going to get you anywhere from the factory double action, single action pull weights to whatever the lowest one is I can get with these two springs. Double action is now actually reading on my scale just above 7 pounds. Single action right at 3 pounds. This is supposed to smooth out the double action pull and correct some mainspring geometry during compression and extension, which may increase mainspring life. It is tapered and radiused right here where it goes through the mainspring seat. It's also polished and nickel boron coated. It comes with a slightly reduced power 20-pound Wolf mainspring. I installed just the strut by itself. I didn't notice any change to the trigger pull and none of the weights changed. I then installed the strut with the included 20-pound mainspring, and this dropped the single action brake weight by a half a pound from 5 pounds to 4.5 pounds, and the double action pull was still maxing out my gauge, so I couldn't quantify any change there. This is the Grayguns enhanced leverage system. It's supposed to reduce double and single action pull weight and improve trigger pull characteristics. There are different shoe options, and the shoe has pre-travel and over-travel adjustment screws. Interesting to note that the factory trigger has an over travel adjustment screw. I really like that. Factory trigger and trigger bar are on the top. This one down here is the ELS system. I inspected the trigger bars and I couldn't tell a difference in critical geometry by eyeballing it and, taking some rough measurements with my calipers. The obvious difference is in the trigger shoe. These two holes in each shoe are the same diameter, so we can just directly measure the web between the two holes to get an idea about the center spacing. This distance on the factory shoe is about 185. That same distance on the ELS system trigger shoe is about 135. There's a difference of about 50 thousandths in hole spacing between these two trigger shoes. This increases the leverage ratio, which should reduce pull weight by giving you more mechanical advantage to pull that trigger bar forward. There will be a trade-off for this increased leverage. The distance the trigger bar will move forward for a given input at the trigger shoe has now decreased. This increase in travel distance needed at the trigger shoe can likely be accounted for by pre- and over travel adjustment. Possibly the geometry of the trigger bar partially accounts for this as well. Maybe there are some other minute differences in the trigger bar that correct for the new lower position of the front pivot point. Now the ELS trigger bar and shoe are installed in the pistol with all the factory springs and other components. I adjusted the pre- and over travel screws all the way out so they won't be affecting the trigger travel. The trigger shoe has now moved forward in double action, and there's more take up to get to the point where the mainspring starts being compressed. Of course, this can be adjusted out. The double action is noticeably lighter, maybe a pound or two, but it still won't register on my gauge. The double action now feels smoother than factory and when the Super Strut was installed. The single action brake is lighter too. It's now around 4 pounds instead of 5. I feel like there was a slight increase in creep in the brake. And there's a bit more over travel now, which can also be adjusted out. The reset feels more positive. The ELS system really smoothed out the trigger action. The trigger bar has a much nicer finish than the factory one, which I think is a big contributing factor to that. I'm about to reinstall all the factory components and springs, but I polished everything. So let's take a look at what I polished and where. The factory mainspring has closed and ground ends. There were quite a bit of sharp edges around the ground end there. So I dressed those up with a stone and then polished the flats. On the hammer strut, I noticed that the mainspring was binding on its seat and it couldn't rotate. So I kind of reprofiled the spring seat a little bit and filed it and polished it up. I also took sharp edges off around the tip of the hammer strut and polished where it interacts with the pin in the hammer. We got to keep in mind with all these parts that this is stamped steel, this is stamped steel, so these have pretty rough edges around the outside. And then the hammer and sear are metal injection molded, so same thing. There's some, rough edges and high spots and things like that on them. On the safety lever here, I polished right here, which interacts with this face of the trigger bar. I also polished the tip of it and kind of took some of the roughness off the tip of it where it interacts with the firing pin safety block, which already has a nice finish on it, so I didn't touch that. On the sear here, I polished this face, which is where this face of the trigger bar interacts with it during the single action pull. I polished this bottom face right here, which interacts with the top of this during the reset. I polished this face because during the double action pull, the hammer gets cocked and it rubs against that area and pushes the sear out of the way. So I also polished that on the hammer. There is now a nice, it may be hard to see, there's a nice mirror polish on the sear ledge right here, and then I knocked some high spots off the sides where there was some non-uniformity from the metal injection molding process, knocked down some sharp edges. Hammer, same thing around the edges, kind of knock down some edges, knock down high spots on the faces where it pivots in the frame. Again, I polished this piece where it pushes the sear out of the way during the double action pull. I now have a mirror finish on the hammer hook face, if you want to call it a hammer hook. And on the trigger bar, this is where the slide contacts it to disconnect the trigger bar and push it down when it reciprocates, and that already had a decent finish on it, but I polished it more for shits and gigs. I did quite a bit of work to clean up the rough edges here and here and here that were left by the stamping process, and then polished them. This surface right here slides underneath the hammer pin like that as the trigger bar comes forward. This top surface interacts with the bottom of that sear projection during the reset. This surface right here pulls that projection on the sear forward during the single action pull. I could see I had some wear marks here, and this is all a fine finish, but there was a pretty nasty burr along this edge from the stamping process. And then I polished this face right here where it grabs the hammer in this notch during the double action pull. Oh, I also polished that in the hammer right there. And then this face also contacts this part of the safety lever and pulls it forward, which pushes this up into the firing pin safety block as you pull the trigger. So all those factory parts and springs are back in the pistol. They're just cleaned up and polished now and lubricated. Noticeably smoother double action. That stage where the safety lever comes into contact with the firing pin safety block is a little bit less noticeable now. Reset is much more positive. Double action still won't register on my gauge. No, single action dropped maybe about a half pound. Yeah, around 4.5. I've done polishing work on a lot of different trigger systems. In general, with pistols, hammer fired pistols respond the best. Double single action generally responds better than single action. And then striker fired pistols, it's a toss up if you'll even notice the polishing work that you did. Usually, trigger pull weight does not drop at all with polishing work. In this case, the single action dropped a half a pound, which is pretty impressive. So it seems that this trigger system responds quite well to polishing, and I think that's just due to a lot of the roughness on the factory parts due to their manufacturing methods. You may be asking yourself the same question that I'm asking myself at this point, and that's how good can this trigger system be? So I'm going to install the Super Strut. I'm going to install the lightest mainspring I have. I cleaned up and polished the ends of it. I'm going to install the ELS system and the reduced power sear spring. I'm not going to do any cleanup or polishing on this trigger bar because it already has a very, very nice finish on it. And I will install this and then adjust my pre-travel and over-travel screws. Let's see how nasty this trigger can be. I have just a little bit of pre-travel now. The double action is incredibly light. 6 pounds. Right around 6 pounds on the double action. Right around 2 3/4 on the single action. Yeah, smidge under 3. I adjusted the over travel as well. Reset is very short, but still nice and positive. Now, of course, when you get into reduced mainspring weights, you might have to worry about light primer strikes. So for my purposes, I don't need a really crazy light trigger in this thing, and I don't want to deal with light primer strikes. So I've installed the green 18-pound mainspring. The reduced power sear spring is still in there, the Super Strut, and the enhanced leverage system. Single action brake is right at 3.5 pounds. Double action is at 7.5. Feels really good. I'm really pleased with it. For my purposes, I could have gotten away with just the spring kit and polishing it, and then adjusting some over travel out, because the factory trigger shoe does come with over travel adjustment. You know, without the ELS system, maybe I would have had to use the 17-pound mainspring to get the brake weight to be 3.5 pounds. All right, that wraps this one up. I hope this was informative, entertaining, or helpful to you in some way. I hope I've given you a good idea of what can be done with the double single action trigger system in the SIG P226 pistols. Maybe you want to upgrade yours. If so, I hope this video has given you a good starting point. If you're familiar with these pistols and this trigger system, leave your tips, tricks, and favorite upgrade parts in the comments so that I and others can see it. Thanks so much for watching. I'll catch you next time.